My name is Bronwyn Williams. I'm a partner at Flux Trends, and today I'm going to be talking to you about positive sustainability or pragmatic optimism. Now, the world-renowned investor Marc Andreessen coined the phrase reality privilege in an interview that he did a couple of years ago. And reality privilege is a rather controversial yet thought-provoking idea. In essence, his point was that reality, the real world, has had over 5,000 years to get good for most people, but for most people, life hasn't got that good. There are still people who go to bed hungry, who sleep on the streets, who have to use pit toilets in schools. And his point was that if we were unable to create a real world that is fulfilling the real needs of more people, that perhaps we should be shifting our attention to virtual alternative realities that can give people, if not the actual reality privilege that the 1% get to enjoy, at least the illusion of it in virtual reality worlds where you can be whoever you want to be and live whatever sort of lifestyle you can imagine. There's just kind of one problem with that point of view, as much as it does have some sort of logic when you follow through the argument, and that is that NFT cake does not fill you up. You're still hungry even after you've eaten an imaginary virtual banquet. The other problem when it comes to real world being replaced with virtual environments is that the virtual environment also has a real environmental cost. Now, there's been a lot written about the environmental and particularly the energy consumption of technologies like crypto and Bitcoin and the world of NFTs. But what we're now starting to realize is that artificial intelligence, such as that of ChatGPT, which many of us are starting to use now, also has a real environmental cost, not just in terms of energy, but also in terms of its water consumption. Now, ChatGPT 3, which was the first version that most of us got to play around with, used something like 700,000 liters of water just to train the models. That's before it even got into our own hands. And every time you ask these artificial intelligence generative programs a question, it's basically the equivalent of taking a full bottle of clean water and pouring it onto the floor. So the point is that even our virtual environments are having a real world cost. Now, of course, as much as there are real challenges, even with our virtual environments, every real problem also presents a real opportunity for businesses and for individuals to get involved with solving that problem and hopefully making a profit for themselves along the way too. What's particularly interesting with the real problems we're seeing now is how obvious they become when we look at price inflation. We see what is becoming cheaper and what is becoming more expensive. And what we start to see quite clearly is that the cost of things like entertainment and data and digital products and consumer goods, consumer electronic goods in particular, those prices are falling. But where we do see price inflation is in things like food security, in water, in energy, in healthcare, in education, in real things that real people need in the real world. And that again is an opportunity for you to get involved in securing your own future and the futures of the communities around you, and perhaps building resilient, sustainable businesses at the same time. And that brings me to a quote by one of my very favorite authors, Terry Pratchett, who once wrote that even if it's not your fault, it is your responsibility. And that's a key point that I want to drive home today when it comes to securing our futures. And when it comes to securing food, water, energy security for ourselves and for our societies, I think that quote really needs to sink in with every one of us right now. Similarly, the work of Albert Hirschman, an academic who put together really a framework for thinking about how we engage with society as individuals and as businesses. And his framework essentially asked us to make two different choices, to choose whether we want to be active participants in society or to be passive and kind of see things as happening to us rather than us happening to things. And then also to make the choice as to whether to be constructive, that is, work to build and strengthen society around us, or destructive, that is, to break it down and work against that system. When we sort of put those two choices together, we get a bit of a matrix, and essentially we're faced with 4 different options that we can take in the face of large challenges. The first choice is to be both passive and to be destructive. In other words, to kind of just see what's going on in the world around us, see what the problems are, and do nothing about them. Almost be like an ostrich and bury your head in the sand. The second choice is to be part of the system, but also then to be passive about it. This is almost like being like a dog who's loyal to its master, even if the master kicks the dog. Again, it's not going to solve the problems around us, even if you are wanting to solve those problems. The third choice is one that's becoming increasingly common, particularly in our society right now. And that's the choice to be active, but to be active as a part of actually breaking that society apart by literally exiting that society. Whether that's through immigration, through physically removing yourself from the situation that you believe is irredeemable, or through financial immigration, that is taking your capital, your resources, your reserves out of that community and placing it somewhere else, which inadvertently, or vertently, depending on how you think about it, actually ends up creating more problems that you were nominally trying to avoid by leaving. Now, the fourth choice is, of course, the hardest choice. This is the choice to use your voice and to be an active citizen for good, to essentially be the change you want to see in the world and be part deliberately of the solution rather than being part of the problem. It requires action and positive action, which is very hard, but it's also a hugely advantageous competitive advantage space to be in. Now, for an example there, we can look across to the other side of the world, to New York City in the United States, where a young man by the name of Daniel Gottlieb has put together a project termed Maximum New York. He took that Terry Pratchett quote under heart, that quote that said that even if it's not your fault that the society around you is not how it should be looking, it is your responsibility. And he put together a project that went around literally picking up trash from New York streets in order to make the city a place that he actually wanted to live in. It started off just with himself, and it's grown into a movement. And in fact, they've got to the point now where they are running out of trash to pick up. They really have used their voice in that sense. Now, closer to home, I think it's also worth thinking about getting skin in the game and the perspective that Easy Equities has done by opening up investing in stocks, shares, companies, and even property to more and more individual retail investors in South Africa. We now see that they have something like 2% of South Africa's population that is now invested directly into our South African economy through their platform. Now, this is not just a story about buying stocks and shares and becoming a capitalist in your own right. It's also really a story about how every one of those investors, once they've invested in a South African business or a South African property, is invested not just in the success of what they've purchased, but also in the success of the community and society around that business or around that property that needs to prosper in order to make sure that investment achieves its full potential. Now, this brings us back to those real problems that I highlighted just a minute ago. The real problems specifically of power, of energy, water, and food security. Energy is, of course, top of our minds as South Africans, sitting in years of absolute record load shedding with no sense of light at the end of the proverbial tunnel. But the challenge really is to use your voice again, to be part of the solution, not to be part of the problem. We can't be like the dog waiting for its master to fix the problem. We have to start taking steps to take back that power into our own hands. And there's a huge amount of power that comes from taking control and for becoming independent and using our agency in that regard. There's never been a better opportunity to invest in kind of going off grid or securing your own future by investing in your own energy production and preservation. There's great incentives going on right now, many more financing opportunities, much more technology that we can take advantage of, but it does require taking that step. The challenge is, of course, to see this as being an investment rather than being a cost, an investment in the future that you want to be a part of going forward. The other thing we have to start taking personal responsibility for is, of course, water. We are going to be going into another drought cycle, likely here in South Africa, as climate change shifts across the world, as it always does. And of course, we need to be very aware of our water consumption, not just in our taps, but also in terms of the technologies that we use. As I mentioned, artificial intelligence and software and data centers all do require water usage, which means being independent from the grid, again, is something that's definitely worth investing in. But I think my big challenge, particularly to businesses and to wealthy individuals who do have the capital and the will to go off grid, is to think about going off-grid not as being a personal, selfish act to kind of preserve yourself from society, to retreat between high walls towards private citadels, because no man is an island. And the only way that we get to grow and really use that voice, not be part of this sort of exit trope that I spoke about today, is to make sure that when we are preserving our own future, securing our own energy and water and food security, but we're also thinking about that challenge of reality privilege and who's being left behind on the other side of the wall. We don't want energy, water, and food security to be a privilege. We want it to be something that is participatory for our whole community. Because again, just like when it comes to investing in a property or investing in a business, that business and that property's success and its worth that grows over time is dependent on the strength of the society around us. So even as we look at ways to become more independent from government and state-subsidized systems, we also need to think about ways to secure our communities too, and to see this as being a sustainable and holistic project going forward. And to that end, the real closing message that I want to give you today is that we do want to be citizens that use our voice, that are part of the solution, that engage in pragmatic optimism and actually see optimism as being a moral duty, even in these scarce times that we're in right now.